Welcome everyone to another edition of Play It Through, and on this edition it's Ninja Gaiden 2, part of the Ninja Gaiden Trilogy for the Super Nintendo, brought to us by Tecmo. This compilation is relatively rare, coming out pretty late in the SNES's life, and has become one of the most expensive of the Super Nintendo titles to get a hold of. These three different versions of the original NES trilogy have a few slight enhancements to the graphics, as well as that the soundtrack has been rearranged. There's only one major issue though with this version, and that is that the controls aren't as tight as they are on the NES versions. The jumping and attacking can sometimes be a bit delayed, causing you to get hit or miss your attack altogether. After the opening cutscene, we come to the title screen where we have Ninja Gaiden Episode 2, The Sword of Chaos, and now we're jumping into the first act of the game, the first level. The controls overall are very similar to Ninja Gaiden 1, and a lot of the atmosphere and aesthetic is very much the same in both this and the NES originals. There are a few new power-ups that have been added to this version. The one that we're going to be using the most, though, is the clone ability. Basically, you can find this orange version of Ryu's head, and if you pick those up, it'll cause a clone or mirrored version of yourself to be behind you. Everything that you do, they in turn do, and you can have two of them going with you at the same time. And if you position things correctly, you can easily take out bosses, being in sweet spots, and hit enemies that are trying to run up from behind you because you have those mirror clones following you. The wall mechanics and jumping onto them is a bit better in Ninja Gaiden 2, where you're able to actually climb up and down them, so it's a bit easier to progress. Here we have the first boss of the game. We're going to run up and attack him a few times, backing away every few swipes. After we get about 6 swipes in, he'll then charge across the screen. Make sure that you jump over him or jump against the left wall and quickly jump over his head, and then continue the pattern of just beating him up and backing away every couple of swipes, and you should be able to take him down before he ends up getting a second charge off. As we begin level number 2, we start off on a train. There's some gaps between the train cars, but thankfully if you fall down, you'll be perfectly fine. You can land on the connectors and then climb your way out. A lot of the same nuisances that were in Ninja Gaiden 1 are here in 2, though it's not as bad as far as respawning enemies, but your knockback is just as bad, where if you get hit by an enemy, you'll fly backwards uncontrollably, and a lot of times can end up getting knocked into pits this way. As we're progressing through, I now have my 2 ninja clones that I'll be using for the game that will really end up helping me out as far as a lot of the key boss battles go. One thing that you can also do in Ninja Gaiden 2 that you couldn't do in 1 as much is jump over a lot of enemies. In Ninja Gaiden 1, a lot of enemies would turn towards you and try to run backwards towards you or swing backwards towards you with their weapon, but thankfully they don't do that in 2, so you're able to kind of jump over them a lot easier. The second area of level 2 though has this whole snow effect with wind that will either push and pull you in the left or right direction, and you'll have to use that wind and momentum in order to make a lot of the jumps throughout this area. Since it changes randomly, make sure that it's going the direction you want before you really attempt any sort of jumps. Enemies with projectiles, like the ones with the guns here, can be a bit tricky to try to dodge their bullet once they start firing. You have a very small window usually you'll be able to get in there and actually order to hit them. But by far, of course, the worst enemy, once again, just like with Ninja Gaiden 1, is the flying enemies. They home in on you, they can spawn in batches, so you'll have 2 or 3 of them coming at you at once. And if you're too fast sometimes, you'll end up having them spawn at the most inopportune times, easily knocking you backwards. We have the second boss up now next, and we're going to start off by using our Ninja Scroll skill in order to try to fire up at him. In order to get him to kind of move and be able to attack him, you'll have to climb up the wall and jump towards him. The clones can really end up helping you during this fight, but you have to kind of get them in that right spot, and because of the wind, it can easily knock you out of that pattern. When you jump up on the platform where he is, though, he will jump down to the bottom one, and then do the same once you go to the bottom one, throwing out all those spiders the entire time. As we begin level number 3, one of the new enemies that we have to deal with in this game is the flames. They are just little fireballs that appear and then start chasing you down. They can be a little bit difficult to hit, especially when they're first spawning, and in some of the areas of the game they can be a real nuisance, as we'll see later on. Right here you want to make sure you drop on down. This will help you as far as being able to climb up the platforms over here. Use our special Ninja Scroll ability though a little bit to help us clear out some of the enemies. During this segment, thankfully there's not a lot of enemies, so we can take our time between the different jumps before finally making it back kind of on solid land. Here, wait for one or both of these flames to be destroyed before attempting to make the last jump, and then head inside to the next area of the stage. Here, we're going to start climbing on up. This enemy does take multiple hits, but we can kind of knock him off of the platform, allowing us to get up there and then climbing up immediately the next ladder so that we're able to continue on here. Areas like the one I was just in where it's so congested with so many enemies, it's near impossible a lot of times to get through it without at least taking a hit or two, but thankfully a lot of the enemies end up only doing a single bar of damage. During this segment, we're taking our time because of so many of these birds spawning, so we're going to try to take them out before attempting to make the next jump. Just make sure that you're far enough over so that when you destroy one, it doesn't immediately end up respawning. Thankfully now we're on the last screen of level 3-2. We're going to run to the right here first, and you have to climb up a little bit and you can get to the platform that's just above us. That enemy there, the big one, can get hit multiple times before you end up defeating him, so you have to be very careful of his projectile trying to jump over it. It's a pretty big commotion, and as soon as you go up the ladder, it kind of just glitches a little bit. Instead of doing any kind of fade in or fade out, it goes right to the boss. Now, for this boss, we're going to use our little mirror effect to kind of help us out. When you attack this guy in the air and you hit him, he ends up falling directly down. So we can have one of our guys in the air and one of them on the ground, and if you do it right, you can actually kind of combo him instantly and get him kind of like in a loop. And thankfully, after a few attempts, I'm finally able to get it here, where he just keeps flying right back up and immediately right back down because I'm able to time those hits. As we drop into level 4, we have a kind of a weird pattern on the cave wall in the background before it opens up to the flame background, which kind of looks pretty cool. A new enemy that's a real pain are these jumping balls. All they do is fly up into the air and then retract and then set a spread shot going in 4 different directions. Thankfully, there's enough of a gap you can easily stand in between them as they explode, but still a bit of an annoying enemy, especially in certain areas, as we'll see a little bit. Right here, we're going to try to outrun this flame, kind of getting it to chase us a little bit before going underneath of it and back up and around to the next ladder. Have a couple of difficult jumps here. Thankfully, if you move quickly, the flames that are spawning from below won't be able to catch up with you. But right after that, you have a series of these giant columns that are pretty small to stand on, and you'll have to kind of make your way. I usually either try to take out the bat or just jump onto one of the columns and get hit by it as it's passing by. That way, if it does run into me, it just ends up hurting me on the column instead of knocking me off into the pit. A bit of a struggle, but finally get through 4-1, and then 4-2 introduces water that will be moving in 2 different directions, of course, pushing and pulling you in whatever way it's flowing. The water can make the platforming a bit more challenging, though I find the wind and then the ice that we have to deal with later to be more annoying overall. Be careful when climbing down the ladder though that you don't just fall off the bottom of the screen, that you are attached to the wall when you leave so that you don't end up losing a life that way. Through this little segment here, we're going to have to climb up this wall, and then we can use the water and work our way over to the right, allowing us to get to other platforms we couldn't reach before. Make sure that you kill the bird as soon as you land on that first one, or he'll probably end up knocking you back and you'll have to redo the area. On the top portion, we can then run across and jump over to this side where we can finally come down the ladder into another whole big thing of water. Be careful of the flames, as they're going to probably chase you for a little bit. If you have something like I do with the fire, you can take them all out in one go. Just go ahead and use one of those. Up here, this bird will spawn from below. Wait for it to come up to you and take it out before attempting to make the jumps, because there's a couple more birds you're going to be dealing with, so it's easier to take out the one, and then when you make across the next couple of platforms, take out that next one. Now, for the boss of this stage, it's a giant creature that's kind of in the background and uses giant claws that come out in order to sweep across. Now, this is a great boss for those mirror clones. If you're able to kind of get them where you need to, you can just keep on swiping and do a lot of damage. Now, I get really lucky here because of a nice little bounce from the one enemy. I'm able to land here while my one ninja is still facing the one direction, so I'm able to kind of just mash the attack button in order to finish it off. Even without the mirrored clones, it's still a relatively simple fight of dodging a lot of those claws and just trying to get in those hits every so often. After what is probably the shortest cutscene in the game between levels, we move on now to level number 5. Start off by making it over a couple of jumps before climbing up here. Have to try to wait for that moment so we can kind of sneak in and hit the guy with the gun, but it can be difficult to hit him without getting hit at least once by his bullets. Once again, the screen kind of glitches as we go down this first ladder here. The next segments all have spikes in them, and thankfully though, the spikes aren't instant death. They do take away 3 or 4 bars of health, but at least they won't kill you instantly. Be careful of the fire down below as this guy spawns. You can kind of jump over his attack, and it takes 3 hits in order to take care of him. Jump in between the spikes and you'll land onto the next screen safely. Next area has a bunch of these guys overhead, and you can jump up and take them out, but unless you're going to be using one of your sub-weapons, I recommend just trying to get through that area as quick as you can. (5-2) is the ice-themed area. Now we have ice that's going to cause us to slip and slide all over the place, easily allowing us to fall into pits or run into enemies accidentally. Definitely a very annoying spot in this game. Controls in Ninja Gaiden are already a bit finicky, and with ice, it just exacerbates that whole kind of process. Be careful and jump up here to climb between the 2 things of ice so that we can get over to the right side. More than likely, the bird that spawns over here on the right will probably end up running into you. Just let it hit you if you're against the wall already, that way you don't get knocked backwards, and then head down the ladder and then do the same on the next screen before eventually making it down the next ladder and end up here. Wait for the right moment before attempting to make the jump across over to the right. There is that jumping guy who will constantly keep spawning and probably run into you once or twice if you don't have a projectile ninja skill to use against him. Be careful on these platforms. There's not a lot of enemies, but of course, since it is slippery, it's very easy to fall off of them. After the pretty lengthy cutscene, we now drop into the next boss battle. The clones are going to really come in handy here, as I'll be able to kind of get them in a position where, when he ends up spawning, I should be able to deliver a couple attacks to him. As you can see, when he does spawn, he ends up causing fireballs all around him in a circular pattern to be pulled towards him and then re-expand out, which can be a bit difficult to initially end up dodging, but if you're far enough to the left or right side, you'll always be able to get out of the way of him. It's just trying to get back in to deliver hits to him if you don't have that mirror ability going into the fight. 6-1 is a pretty simple looking level, but there is a big aspect to it that can make it a bit difficult. As you can see, the rock formations are actually in the foreground for the most part, and because of this, they can end up blocking your view, especially from some of the more annoying enemies. Over to the right, we're actually going to drop down an opening, which will actually take us to another area instead of kill us like every other pit in the game does. I guess because it has that nice little border around it, it's perfectly safe. Throughout this area, we have plenty of flying enemies, bats, birds, and then these guys that we saw earlier on in the game that pop up and then end up causing that fire to kind of shoot out in 4 different directions. As we begin 6-2, we have a nice sunset going on in the background. It starts off pretty level, so a lot of the enemies are easy to jump over their abilities and being able to take them out pretty safely. While you're going to get bombarded by a lot of enemies during this segment, thankfully it's pretty straightforward. There's no real jumping or anything like that we have to worry about too much before we end up reaching the end and make it to the next boss fight. Now this boss is pretty much a rematch against one of the bosses from Ninja Gaiden 1. You have these 2 gargoyles that end up spawning and only one of them can end up being hurt. Once again, the mirror guys will end up helping you a lot as far as delivering lots of hits, but if you don't have that, you'll have to slowly kind of follow the one that you actually can damage. You can take out some of the projectiles if you time it just right with your sword attacks, but it can still be difficult not to end up getting hit a few times while going through. We're now on to the 7th and final level of the game. We have a weird green waterfall that's kind of going on in the background. Take the lower path here. We're going to wait for the slime to bounce off the one of the walls, and then we can kind of quickly get above it. Drop on down here first to take out a large group of the enemies. You'll then be able to climb up this kind of other wall right there so that you can reach the platforms above. The bird that ends up popping up during this segment, take him out before attempting to make any more of the jumps. Once you climb up the ladder, in the next room you'll have all those little flames starting to spawn and chase you around. You want to quickly kind of get underneath one of them. You may want to take him out and then quickly climb up and get to the next ladder. This spot here can be a bit tricky with everyone throwing stuff at you as well as the consistently spawning flying enemies. Over to the right, you want to jump to this column after avoiding the thing popping out of the pit. You can climb up and use your ninja skill if you have one in order to take out the serpent on top before attempting to jump up there. The screen has more of those annoying little flames. We're going to try to get them down into the lower left corner. Once I end up taking out most of them, I'm going to quickly climb up the platforms and get up the ladder. Once you're up here, head over to the left. Just take the bottom path here. You may get a couple of enemies and gunfire coming your way before making it to another cutscene. Starting off 7-2, we're going to climb up this first column and use that to jump our way over to the left. Here, we're going to take this platform, bounce off the one to the upper right, and that'll allow us to kind of get up to the top. Gotta be very careful at this corner, waiting for the flying thing to go past, as well as the thing jumping out of the pit. At the top, you may need to wait a second or two for this guy to get away from the edge, and then do the same with the next platform. The spitting serpent that's right on the edge there can be a bit of a nuisance for sure while we try to make our way over to the next ladder. Once up here, just ignore what's going on the far right, just bounce off the walls and continue climbing up. Be careful when making this long jump over to the right here. You'll have one of those guys kind of throwing his weapon towards you. He takes, of course, multiple hits to defeat, so we're just going to kind of bypass him if possible. When we drop down here, we have to take out a guy with a gun, and then one of those birds is going to be spawning and trying to hit you. Take your time slowly so you can jump to each column individually and take out each bird as they're spawning instead of having a whole bunch of them spawn at one exact spot. Thankfully, this room is pretty easy. If you're quick about it, you can kind of get up very fast to the next ladder without the flames being able to catch up to you. This is the final little stretch here before we end up making it to the long gauntlet that is the final boss encounter of the game. When we make it to this platform here, a lot of enemies end up spawning. Thankfully, the clones were able to help me out a little bit before I hit the door. And now, after another cutscene, we have the beginning of the final boss. For this first form, he's floating all around the room, and he kind of does a weird kind of loop around when doing so. Because of the shape of the pattern, he ends up making up new ground each time he ends up doing it. A lot of this battle will come down if you have the mirror guys. They will really help you out because they can just be in weird positions in order to deliver a hit or two. You basically need to wait for him to stop throwing the projectiles and sneak in order to deliver a hit or two while still avoiding him as he flies around, then quickly get away before he ends up doing the flame attack again. You also need to make sure that you conserve as much health as you possibly can because, of course, we have more battles to go and we don't get any more health back. After a really challenging fight, we move on to the second form of the final boss. Now for this form, he has a giant head basically on the far right side, and we're going to be jumping up to kind of attack him in where the nose, I guess, would be. He ends up firing out a projectile straight at us that you can kind of manipulate if you time it right, where it'll fire out a little bit farther to the left and you can kind of get underneath of it and get back to the right wall. As long as one of the drops of purple liquid aren't coming down, you'll then be able to jump up in the air in order to deliver an attack or two. Of course, the mirror guys help out like always, but even without them, this is thankfully a relatively easy fight compared to the first one. Now it's time for the actual final boss encounter. He has two hands that he ends up throwing out. We're going to jump over the first hand and then duck, using the mirror guys to help us out as far as destroying the giant head. If you don't have them, you'll just have to kind of get up close to them, deliver a couple of attacks, and then keep dodging by jumping over or ducking underneath the hands. The second part of the battle, though, is very easy. We're just going to get in order to deliver jump attacks or use the mirror guys to help us out while avoiding all the stuff that's flying everywhere. It's kind of a crapshoot on if you'll be able to dodge everything long enough in order to deliver enough hits, but if you do so, you get to sit back and enjoy the ending to Ninja Gaiden 2. So there you have it, guys, Ninja Gaiden 2 for the Super Nintendo. The NES version is easily my favorite of the NES Trilogy of games. I really wish the controls overall were a bit better on this version in particular, because it's still a pretty solid plain Ninja Gaiden game. Of course, at the end though, we just go back to the title screen where you can select the same game again, or pick one of the other two. With that being said though, guys, that's going to wrap up this episode of Play It Through. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course, I hope you enjoyed.